Daf Mem Amud Aleph will begin Daf Lamed Tes Amud Beis, the second line from the bottom. Amar Mar Zutra Lo Limcha Inish Kedera Bekimcha Da'avshuna. A person shouldn't thicken a pot. Sometimes you put in flour into a pot and it makes the soup or whatever is being cooked there thicker. You shouldn't thicken the pot even with flour of oven-dried grain. Now, when you harvest the grain and you bake it in the oven, and then the baking it inhibits the process of chimutz. So something that's baked in the oven, something that's baked, then really there should be no problem of chimutz, and therefore, strictly speaking, the flour that's from that type of grain you should be able to use in the pot. You should be able to thicken it. But nevertheless, he said you should not. Why? Maybe it wasn't baked properly, maybe it wasn't completely dried out. And then it could come lidei chimutz when you start the cooking process. So therefore, because of that chashash, you should not use it. Rav Yosef lo lichlot inish. Scalding also inhibits the process of chimutz, but he said lo lichlot inish, you should not scald trei chiti b'hanei adari, 2 kernels of wheat together. Why is that? Because because maybe one of the kernels will now get attached to the crack or crevice or cleft in the other one, and therefore the water won't surround it completely, and it won't get completely scalded in the water. And the bubbling of the boiling water won't penetrate to all 4 sides, so therefore it won't be completely scalded, and therefore it'll come lidei chimutz. Abai says, you should not take 2 stalks of grain and singe them together. The singeing inhibits the chimutz, but you shouldn't do 2 together, because maybe the moisture from one, will seep out from one and then penetrate into the other one. And therefore the second stalk, therefore in effect, becomes boiled, and it has the water, the moisture that penetrates to it, that it comes lidei chimutz. Rava said, if that's the case, well, if you have that chashash, you'd have the chashash even by 1 stalk. Why is that? Because maybe the moisture will seep out of it on one end of it, and it'll penetrate to the other end of it. So you'd still have it even by 1 stalk. Maybe from one end of it to the other end, the moisture will come out, and it will now penetrate into the other end of it, and then it'll make chimutz. Rava said, why are we not chayshish? We're not chayshish by 1, and we're not chayshish by 2 either. Why not? Rava may paris nenu, because whatever it seeps out of this is considered may paris. It's not considered water. It's considered fruit juice. May paris and machmitzin, and the fruit of the juice do not cause chimutz. So therefore, we don't have this chashash, and therefore it's not a chashash by 2 either. And Abai also retracted his position, and he said that you could singe 2 stalks together, but he gave it for a different reason. He retracted, but for a different reason, because he said the whole agav adlayhu loy mechamsi, because as long as it's flowing, as long as the liquid is flowing, that constant motion of it inhibits the chimutz. So therefore, we don't have to be concerned, because if it's flowing as it continues to flow, and therefore it won't come lidei chimutz. So therefore, you don't have that problem. The Amar Abai says hachatzva da'avshuna, and you have a jug that's used for toasting grain. So the halach is sechifa shari. If it's inverted, if it's turned the other way, then it's mutter. Zakifa also, if it's upright, then it's also. So if it's inverted, then it's mutter, because the juice will flow down. So we have the flowing motion. But if it's upright, it's not flowing down, and therefore it could come lidei chimutz. So therefore, in both cases it's mutter, but there's enough gemina that according to Abai, it's only if it's flowing, otherwise not. But according to Rava, it's much broader of a heter, and whether it's flowing or not flowing, the peiros are not machamitz, don't come lidei chimutz. And so Tosfos has a whole discussion over here. Therefore, can you knead with mei peiros? And Rabbeinu Tam holds that Mei Paris is mutter, that dough kneaded with Mei Paris is mutter, but the Minig Ashkenaz is to answer it and not permit the dough that was kneaded with Mei Paris. Tan Rabbanon ein loisim ser b'Pesach. As we learned previously, the minig was to soak the barley in water for a short period of time, and that would allow us to, when you pound the barley and process it, it will become much cleaner. The bran will be removed from it because it was softened up with the lasisa. So we learned the brisa ein loisim ser b'Pesach. You cannot soak the barley with water on Pesach because of a chashash of chimutz. V'im losas, if he did, then the halach is nisbaku asuras. If the grain was split, then it's also, because since it was split, the water can penetrate more, it can leaven it more quickly, and come lidei chimutz more quickly. So it's also lo nisbaku mutoras, but if they do not split, then they're mutter. Rav Yosi says, shayrim b'chaimitz, you soak them in vinegar, b'chaimitz, same son, and the vinegar will cause them to contract or cause them to shrivel up, and therefore that will inhibit the chimutz. Amar Shmuel ein halacha ki Rav Yosi. Shmuel says the halacha is not like Rav Yosi, that we don't rely on the vinegar to inhibit the process of chimutz. Amar Rav Chis Amar Ukva lo nisbaku mamish. When it says nisbaku that it's also, it doesn't mean that it literally mamish is split. It means just that it's softened up and weakened enough that if you would put it on a barrel of wine, that the aroma, the vapor from the wine would cause it to split. It's been softened to that extent that it could split under those circumstances. Shmuel Amar nisbaku mamish. Shmuel says no, it's only if it was actually split. Only if we see that it's split, then we have to be chayshish for chimutz. But if it's not actually split, then it's mutter. Ovet Shmuel uvda bedura deve bar choshu, he paskind in the house of bar choshu nisbaku mamish. That only if it is actually split. The Meforshim asks the question, well, if that's the case, so Shmuel's understanding that it's only also nisbaku mamish, so how do we understand the machlokes now between the Tanakama and between Rav Yosi? Because Rav Yosi says that sharim b'chaimitz should soak in vinegar, and the Tanakama answers that. Now, if Tanakama is only answering if it's actually split, well, Rashi says the purpose of the chaimitz is to ensure that it doesn't split. You put it beforehand, and therefore you soak it beforehand in the vinegar, and it hardens it, it shrivels it, and contracts, and therefore it doesn't split. Well, if the Tanakama only answers when it splits, so then what's the problem with vinegar? Why does he disagree with Rav Yosi? So the Ran explains as follows. He says, according to Rav Yosi, the vinegar, now it contracts the grain, so it doesn't split, and it inhibits the chimutz. But according to the Tanakama, he holds, no, that the chaimitz has a negative effect, because even though it inhibits it, shrivels it up, but internally, when it penetrates in the inside, it does not inhibit the chimutz, and it actually causes chimutz, which you can't see because on the surface of it, it hasn't split. So he says that no, the vinegar is also because you won't be able to tell if there's a chimutz. Whereas Rav Yosi says, no, the chimutz doesn't occur with vinegar. When you have the vinegar, when you have the chaimitz, it inhibits the chimutz. It's not going to crack, and it's not going to cause chimutz internally either. Amar Rabba says, Bal nefesh lo yiltos. He says that Bal nefesh, a person who is a conscientious person, should not soak the grain on Pesach. Right? We said before that lasisa was done to remove the bran, but this should not be done because of chashash of chimutz. The Gemara, my area bal nefesh. Why do you say dafka bal nefesh? Afilu kol almanami. The Hatanya ain't loisim serim b'Pesach, because it says you can't soak the barley on Pesach. Gemara says hachikama. This is what he means. This is what Rabbah means. Bal nefesh afilu chitin the shrir lo yilto is not only sarim. The Bryce is referring to sarim, but bal nefesh should not even soak chitim, even though they're hard. And you would think that the chashash is less over there by chitim. Nevertheless, the bal nefesh should not soak it. Omerle Rav Nachman said, "Man detzayis le'laba, the one who listens to Rabbah, achal nama di pusha, he'll be eating spoiled bread." Because he doesn't do l'sisa, and he's saying l'sisa, you shouldn't do it, and therefore he'll have the bran, and he'll have bread that's spoiled. And he says, and I'll bring you a raya that it's not so, that it's not like Rava. Daha be Rav Huna lasasi, v'chei be Rava baravin lasasi, because they would soak it. They did soak the wheat on Pesach. So he says, therefore, it is mutter, and you don't have to eat it with the grains that's not, with the wheat that's not soaked, and you don't have to eat this kind of coarse spoiled bread. Rava has another opinion. Rava Amar also liltais. He says it's also to soak, even wheat. It's also. So we had Rav Nachman who said it's mutter. We had Rava said it's bal nefesh, shouldn't do it, but Rava said that it's even also to soak wheat. We learn in the Bryce in Leisim Serim Pesach. It says the Isser is on barley. Serim hu deloy ha chitim shari, which implies that chitim is muter. The more answers loy mi boy kamer. Loy mi boy chitin. It means that it's not only loy mi boy chitin, not only chitin, that it's also a cave in the Yisbeit series, since it has a bridges in it, it has clefts in them, so Ailabe Maya, the water will penetrate and get in and cause chimuds. But barley, which is the shia, which is smooth. You might think Emashapidami Kamash Malan. That's why the Brisa teaches you sorry, meaning the reason the Brisa says Sirim is not to la'afuke chitim, not to say only barley and wheat is mutter. No, not only is wheat also, but even barley is also. That's the way Rava learns it. Rava retracted his position because he said that mutter liltais, no, that he originally said it's also to do l'sisa, then he said no, it's mutter. What's the right of signing? Because it says in the Baraisi, they can be the mitzvah of matzah with pas, that's nikia, and it's made with, it's refined with white, refined flour, it's white bread, v'hadra, or coarse bread. Now v'yesh nikia b'loy l'sisa. So how do you have that it's a nikia, that it's refined, that it's white? It must be with l'sisa. So you see that l'sisa is mutter. Rapapa asks on that assumption. You're saying that you can't have refined white bread without l'sisa? No. It says that kamachim es shel nachrim, if you have the flour, or the refined, fine flour of nachrim, shel kforim, if it's from villagers, tahar. It's tar, it's not makabel tumah. Why is it tar? Because in order to be makabel tumah, it has to have a bihuch shel makabel tumah. It has to come into contact previously with the liquid. Now, in the villages, they're not makbid, and so they don't do l'sisa, so it didn't come into contact with the liquid, and therefore it's tar. Vishal krachin tmeim. But in the cities, they're more makbid, they're more particular. They do l'sisa. It came into contact with the liquid. It's huchshel kabel tuma, so it's tomei. Now, the kforim, my time, why do we say the kforim? Why do we say that it's tar la mishum delay losi? Must be that they don't do l'sisa. They don't soak the grain in water. It didn't come into contact with water. It could correlate soilus, and still it calls it soilus. So you see that you can have fine flour, even though there is no l'sisa. The Gemara says no. Targuma akimcha. That it says that is when it's torn, it's talking about the kemach, the plain flour, not the fine flour. So it's not referring to that case. So when it says akamochim vaslas shel nochim, it says shel kforim. So the way Taisus explains it is shel kforim taharim, meaning it's going on the kemach. It's going on the kemach. Shel krachim tameim, it's going on. It's referring to the case of the soilus. So Targuma Kimcha. Balsid Nafik, when Rava went out, Amar Papa said, my time alayim. Why don't we say to him from the following? And you will see from the following statement that we'll see from the following statement that it's not like Rava. The Omar Reb Zera, Omar Reb Yerim Bar Shmuel, Amar Shmuel, Chitin Shel Menocha is the wheat that's used for the Menocha, is for the bring the Mincha, Ein Loisem, there's no Lasisa, Ein Loisem Loisam, Vikor Lasailas. They don't do Lasisa. They don't do Lasisa over there. And nevertheless, it's called silas, it's fine flour. So don't we see clearly that even without lasisa, you can make silas fine flour? So therefore, you see clearly that it is not a raya, it's not necessarily connected one to the other, and therefore Rava's position that the proof that therefore lasisa is mutter, and that would not have been a proof. But Rava now changed his position, and he went even a step further, and he said, originally he said, Lasisa, even with Chitin is also. Then he said it's mutter. Rava, he took a step further and said, mitzvah lilsais. It's a mitzvah to do Lasisa. Shenemar, because it says, Ushmatim is a matzahs. The Torah says they have to guard the matzahs, make sure that it doesn't become chometz. Eloi, the boy Lasisa, Shimur Lamai. If not for the fact that you have to guard it, then what's the shimur for? Meaning, the way the Ran explains it is, it says you have to make sure that it doesn't become chometz. Now the Torah says that chometz is also. We know that chometz is also. So, like when you have any isser, then you have to make sure that there's no isser. That you have to make sure that whatever the isser involved is, that there's no nevela, there's no basar uchalo, there's no noiser. The Torah doesn't have to tell you an additional mitzvah to make shimur. Must be that the Torah is telling you that you have to ensure, you have to make something, put it in a position where it could be chometz, and make sure that it doesn't become chometz. So Eloi the boy l'sisa, if not that it has to be soaked, where then it could be chometz, shimur l'mayim. What do you have to guard it for? What's the special guarding over here? What are you guarding it from? Must be that it must be something where it's susceptible to chimutz, and you're ensuring that it's not. Ishim or delisha, if you're telling me against, they have to guard it during the kneading process, shimur delisha lav shimur, that's not considered, that's not a fulfillment of the shimur. The Ravuna B'Tsegeh Shel Nochrim, he says that the dough from the Nochrim, that if it's not chometz, if you have the dough where it's not chometz, Adam Amal Kris Mehem, B'Pesach Al Mekris Mehem, you can fill your stomach with them on Pesach. It's not chometz, as long as it doesn't have simonim of chometz, then you can eat from it. Bulvad sheyoichal kazayis matzah b'achrein. But you have to have a kazayas of matzah at the end. You have to have a kazayas matzah. What's l'shem mitzvahs matzah. Ba'achreina in rishayna lo. It's dafki ba'achreina that you have to have that. But b'rishayna with the initial one, the ones that from the Nochrim, then you can't be yoitz with that. You can't be yoitz your mitzvah of matzah with the isa of the Nochrim. My time, why not? Mishum Dovid was shimur. Now it's not chometz, so it must be that there's a special mitzvah of shimur, and therefore that didn't have shimur, and therefore you can't be yoitz. What's the problem? Well, it's only dough. So make the shimur now. You only had the dough from the Nochrim, so bake it l'shem mitzvahs matzah, and you can be yoitz. Why can't you be yoitz the shimur with the baking? Doesn't that teach you that just like you can't be yoitz the shimur at the dough at the stage where you're baking the dough, well, there should be no difference, and you can't be yoitz the shimur even when you're kneading the dough, which means that you have to have the shimur, he's learning, at the time when it's grain, even before that. So that must mean l'sisa at the time of the l'sisa when it's a grain, and that's where you need the shimur. So therefore, he holds it's a mitzvah lilsis. Breaking more, what's your right? Umimai dil meshayni hasam the beitna the nochas l'shimur lo avid l'shimur. Aval heicha the beitna the nochas l'shimur and avid l'shimur hachinami the shimur the lisha avid shimur. What's your right? Maybe it's only over there that at the time then when you needed shimur, when water was added to the dough, meaning at the kneading stage, lo yavid l'shem, you didn't make the shimur. So that's why there's a chasar. And that's why baking is not sufficient. That's why shimur at the time of baking is not sufficient. But the nochel shimur was the time when it was needed to be guarded, it needed shimur, meaning the hainu, the lisha stage. And over there, avid shimur, if you made a shimur over there, then hachanam the shimur lisha have a shimur, then shimur of lisha would be sufficient. So what's your raya? Perhaps it's only over there that because it needed a shimur at the lisha stage, and it was shalnachim, there was no shimur at the lisha stage, and that's why you're missing, it's a chasaron in the shimur. And the shimur of baking is insufficient, but perhaps that the shimur of Elisha is enough, and therefore you don't need a special shimur prior to that at the stage where it's grain. But nevertheless, even in spite of this taina, Rava was not chayzer, he didn't retract his position. He said to those people that turn over the sheaves at the time of the harvest and tied them into bundles, when you turn them over, even for that stage, do l'shem mitzvah. Alma kasavar shimur mi'ikara mitchilos about sefer beina. That must mean that he holds you need shimur right from the inception, right from the beginning to end. So that's where you need the shimur. You need shimur right from the beginning, right from the beginning to the end. This is as the kasha. Well, if that's the case, if you're telling me that you need shimur from the time of hipuch, well, what's your raya that you have to do l'sisa? So tell me that means you need shimur right from the inception, even at the time of the harvest. You need it from the time of the beginning, and therefore, where's the requirement of l'sisa? I'm mekayim the shimur at the inception, at the stage of the grain, but who says you need l'sisa? So maybe there's no mitzvah l'sisa at all, and you're mekayim the shimur right from the beginning to the end. Taisus answers that the ikar shimur has to be, shimur means shimur that it is not, doesn't come lidei chimutz. That's the ikar shimur. It's not that it's done lishma l'shem mitzvah of matzah. That's not the ikar shimur. The ikar shimur is shimur where there's no chimutz. Now, if it wouldn't be for the fact that you need shimur at the time of l'sisa, in the stage where it's a grain, you wouldn't need a shimur at the time of when you're now tying it into bundles, at the time when it's sheaves of grain. Must be, Rava's point is that there must be a shimur at the time of grain. What is ikar shimur? That is shimur from chimutz. So that must be that at the stage of grain, it comes into contact with water, because if it doesn't come into water, there's no chashash chimutz. So that must mean that there's shimur by l'sisa. That means there's shimur at the stage where it's a grain. So therefore, by extension, it's shimur at the time of grain. It's even from the inception, from beginning to end. Mar Brei de Ravina. His mother stored the grain for him in buckets. He was stored in buckets that to be specially the grain that was harvested for the purpose of the matzahs of Pesach. So we see that there is a shimur, that there's a special shimur, and right from the beginning, right from the inception. And that's why there's a hidur, and there's a different discussion in the Paiskim to what extent this is required, but there's certainly a hidur that there's a shimur, even from the time of ksira, from the time of the inception, that there's a shimur l'shem mitzvahs matzah.